On 26/11, when Ajmal Amir Kasab had been after the attack, few would have imagined that there would be a debate or a discussion or a controversy now about a legal case around Kasab. But that's exactly what happened. Let's update you with what happened today. The lone captured terrorist during the 26/11 attack, Kasab has now asked for a Pakistani lawyer after several attempts to get him an Indian lawyer have failed. This followed soon after the designated lawyer Anjali Wagmare was today removed from defending Kasab. That's one of our top stories today. To Kasab's demand for a Pakistani lawyer, Special Public Prosecutor Ujjwal Nikam said that the 26/11 terrorist will be given either a Pakistani or an Indian lawyer, and that requests would be sent through diplomatic channels to Pakistan. This follows Kasab asking for a Pakistani lawyer to represent him in this case. Now, should this entire matter come to this kind of a point, should we even consider organizing or arranging a Pakistani lawyer? And why this messy trial going on and the controversies about Kasab's legal case? Well, we have two very eminent lawyers joining us on the News Hour this evening. Harish Salve is with us live. Thank you very much, Mr. Salve. Thank you for coming. And Indira Jaisingh is with us, very eminent and very outspoken lawyers, both of them. Ms. Jaisingh, thank you. And Harish Salve, thank you. I know that both of you have contrarian views on this. I just want to ask you first, Mr. Salve, this question about Kasab possibly diplomatic channels being used to get him a Pakistani lawyer, what do you think about it?
It's a nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I don't know where this is going to end, and I don't see why we must get him a Pakistani lawyer. Tomorrow you will say actually the American criminal trial lawyers are the best, and how about the government of India hiring him an American criminal trial lawyer, the guy who got O.J. Simpson off? I mean, let's get him to defend Kasab, right? I don't know where this is going. He's entitled to legal representation. We will get an Indian lawyer who can give him legal representation. That's about it.
Why is this happening? I mean, in which other country would there be a discussion on, should his mother now visit him in India? What kind of a lawyer should be done? I mean, the court saying we will do whatever is legally possible in this case, including a Pakistani lawyer for him. Yeah. This is getting very messy.
Well, yes, I agree with you that it's getting very messy, but the issues are very fundamental, and they are the right to a fair trial. Kasab, as much as any one of us, has that right.
True.
Regardless of nationality, if a crime is committed on Indian soil,
yes,
it's liable to be tried.
Yes.
Now, in this country, there is a guaranteed right to legal aid, and a person is entitled.
But how far do we stretch that? This whole business of we should do everything that is legally right. I mean, legally right. How far do we extend this? There's a public sentiment also about this entire case.
I'm sorry, fundamental rights are not subject to public sentiment. The right to a fair trial is a fundamental right. So is the right to legal aid. So we cannot negotiate away his
fundamental rights. I'm just playing devil's advocate. Are for Indian citizens
no,
who abide or abide in Indian, not for a Pakistani terrorist.
Well, the right to life is available even to non-citizens. And as I said, any accused person who has committed a crime on Indian soil is entitled to a fair trial. This is a commitment we have made internationally and nationally in our constitution. Now, may I just finish? The point is that he is entitled. You said how far can we stretch it?
Yes.
The elementary requirement is that a person is entitled to counsel of their choice, unless there is some reason why they can't be given counsel of their choice. An amicus curiae does not substitute for a counsel of your choice. Let me tell you, I had the same problem with the Afzal Guru case. Please allow me to make that parallel.
I'm not stopping you, please.
In Afzal Guru's case, he was represented by a very junior lawyer. Now, he was an Indian citizen.
Yes.
So let's take the case of an Indian citizen who's been denied a fair trial. He was also accused of being a terrorist. He was tried. He was represented by a junior lawyer. He expressed his lack of confidence in this lawyer, and the court appointed that same person as an amicus curiae. I think there can't be a greater denial of fair trial. I did raise this issue in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't agree, but now his clemency petition. Now, you can't do the same thing.
Indira Jaisingh, there are, I don't know. I don't know if Harish Salve tonight on this show is going to stand by what he said. after 26/11. Because at that time there was this whole controversy going on. The entire country was looking at it. What kind of trial should be given to Kassav? And that time Harish Salve said, I don't know if this is exact. He said, you start a trial and it's going to end up in some kind of a disarray. Now, what has happened today is disarray. The only word to describe what happened in court today about the Kassav trial is disarray.
Give me a minute.
No, he said then,
yes,
let him be declared a prisoner of war instead of being given a lawyer.
Just give me a minute.
Yeah.
I do not believe Harish, who is greatly committed to human rights and to fundamental rights, would ever disagree with me that an accused is not entitled to legal aid.
But he had another point. From an average citizen point of view, the worry is this is disarray. Now this is going to be one big drama.
Yes.
The people elsewhere will say, oh, look at the drama going on in Indian courts. They can't find him a lawyer. There is public pressure. There are protests.
Yes.
Then you have to change the lawyer. They have to come back to Pakistan to look for a lawyer.
I would like to respond to that, please. I think there is disarray, but I think the state is responsible for it.
Let me get Harish Salve into it. He's been listening on patiently. Yes, Mr. Salve.
Arnab, I fully stand by what I said. I felt and I feel even today more so. We have to draw a distinction between Indian citizens and foreigners who are what I call illegitimate soldiers, and we must deal with them through military commissions like the US deals with them through military commissions. We have to seriously think that. But we have gone down the road of the Criminal Procedure Code and now the theatre has begun in India. And I agree entirely with Indu that conceptually you are entitled to a lawyer of your own choice. But let's see how far can we run this. A lawyer of his own choice is, tomorrow if Kassav says, either Mr. Jethmalani or Mr. Shanti Bhushan defend me, or Miss Indra Jaising defend me, or I don't want anybody else. Does he have that right? I don't think the Constitution guarantees anybody that kind of a right. When it says you are entitled to a lawyer of your choice, it is within reasonable bounds. And those reasonable bounds are the state will provide one or the other lawyer, not to say we will bend all rules and get you a Pakistan lawyer as a nonsense.
Mr. Salve, you see, we have a lot of viewers who've been writing in, and the general sentiment has been, Mr. Salve, and I want to put it to you and first to Indra Jaising. We put ourselves in a corner by putting Kassav under the Criminal Procedure Code. He is somebody who has waged a war against India, and hence he should have been declared under a different precinct on the law. There is a view that we wanted to make an example of how the high standards of the Indian legal system, the equality of everybody before Indian law, etc., etc. In the process, we landed ourselves in this mess.
No, what Mr. Salve is suggesting is an amendment to the law, okay? As of today, we don't have a choice except to try him under ordinary Indian Penal Code and Criminal Procedure Code. Okay. He's making a suggestion for the future, not as far as the current law is concerned. It is not a suggestion that it can be done under today's law. Now, I know I'm as much concerned as you are about the mess that this case has ended up in. I think that the blame for this mess has to be laid squarely on the shoulders of the prosecution, squarely on the shoulders of the government. This whole thing should have been much better planned.
So there is a mess. We realize there is a mess.
Yes.
And in the mess, law is all about precedent. Some terrorist somewhere is going to say that in India, and this, tell me, Mr. Harish Salve, this is a very layman argument, it sounds like a layman argument, that in India you can have a 60-hour long attack, you can have 10 people arrive in boats, kill 160 people, injure 300 others, and then be in a situation there's a possibility of their mother visiting them, and a legal debate going on what kind of lawyer, possibility of even flying down a lawyer to defend you. I mean, what is the precedent that is being set here, Mr. Salve?
The precedent is being set of our trying to be, I don't know what we are trying to tell the world. We are such a noble state that we welcome people who come and attack us, and the message we are giving is, don't bother if you want to come and attack us. If we catch you alive, we'll treat you very well, and we will create so much confusion, maybe, you never know, you get acquitted. So this is making, I'll tell you today, Arnab, my biggest concern is, as it is, people in India, their faith in the criminal justice system is very shaky. The delays and the kind of problems we have, the faith is shaky. We do not need this kind of a theatre to convince Indians that your criminal justice system itself is fundamentally flawed. And what happens is, you asked Indu a very important question, how far will we stretch these rights? When these rights are stretched to these extremes, people start questioning the basis of these rights. People start feeling there is something wrong with the right, whereas what is wrong is the way in which this right is being expansively construed. And believe me, I I'm saying so publicly. I think all this is possibly being done not for all the right reasons.
Now that's an important statement that you're making, but I don't want to take it further because this is how going on in courts, and you as an eminent lawyer know that we don't want to impute any motives here and there. But a question is that I want to take, despite the position you have taken, tell me as a lawyer that Indira Jaising, you have a Kasaf kind of trial, and the judge has said that whoever is to handle this case needs to be a lawyer who can handle it properly and with due diligence. And then there's a controversy about whether there's a conflict of interest, whether the lawyer who was defending Kasaf has links to a potential prosecution witness. So Harish Salve is right. I mean, there are so many loopholes, and did nobody know that this lady could have had links to a prosecution witness? Because this is a huge embarrassment for this country internationally.
As I said, the blame has to be laid squarely on the state, which is responsible for expeditious, proper and fair prosecution. This has not been done. I think we should focus our attention on how the criminal justice system functions in this country and why is it so poor. Mr. Salve mentioned delays. Ask him what happened in the Gujarat case, 2002 riots. Now in 2009, we are being told that there will be fast-track courts. Why was there no fast-track court for Kasaf? It could have been, see, this is an open and shut case. No, just listen to me. This is an open and shut case. We would have got a conviction for Kasaf if only he was given a proper lawyer to defend himself from day one. He would have been convicted.
But the sentiment out there, I must share this with both my guests this evening and also with the viewers, is that we must be more concerned about the human rights of those whose lives have been violated forever instead of the human rights of Ajmal Kasaf. Now, if that sounds like too much of a layman argument, I'm sorry, but that's the sentiment that's coming across from most of our viewers. Harish Salve and Indira Jaising for presenting two very astute and important points of view in a highly confusing and messy scenario we might have as well have avoided. Thank you very much. And we have our election debate coming up in 2 minutes. We're going to ask a few pointed questions. In fact, we have 4 pointed questions for our representatives from the Congress and the BJP, including, do they have one main issue in such a big election? Some straight questions. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to the News Hour. Welcome back to the News Hour. I'd like to just begin by reminding you that tomorrow 8 a.m. onwards we have live coverage of phase 1 of Decision 09. Tomorrow 17 states, 124 seats are going to elections, and we have 50 reporters spread out to get you maximum coverage. Not just of who's voting, how many people are voting, but what the sentiment and the pulse on the ground is. And we have a special show immediately after this where we go across to all our reporters live to get you maximum coverage of that event. Now, representing the BJP this evening on the Decision 09 debate is Ravi Shankar Prasad. Good evening and thanks for coming back, Mr. Prasad. And Mr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, spokesperson of the Congress Party, is also with us. I have 4 questions, gentlemen, because we wanted to make today's debate both more balanced and more pointed. So I want to pick up on the key issues which came up today, just before phase 1 of voting. And may I begin by asking you first, and I'll come to you for a response, Mr. Prasad, but to you, Mr. Singhvi, first. The Prime Minister met editors this morning and he made a statement which alarmed a lot of people. He said, after running a coalition that includes so many regional parties, he said regional parties are the obstacle to growth. Give me a pointed answer, Mr. Singhvi. If the Prime Minister of a coalition government that needs the support of regional players says regional parties are an obstacle to growth, will he have the same point of view after the 16th of May and say, I will not ally with parties that are an obstacle to growth? These were his words.
Arnab, you have to appreciate the comment in the context which is made. The Prime Minister was not talking about any particular regional party. The Prime Minister was not criticizing any particular grouping. The Prime Minister was actually conveying a sentiment, and let me tell you, if you took a poll on that, you would have 90% people having the same sentiment, that there is a cacophony and a seeming chaos in a democracy with over 55 odd parties. So what he was saying was that sometimes the things we criticize, uncertainty, slow decision making, the lack of a consensus to pass a statute, much less a constitutional amendment, to take bold steps for development, these things suffer because by consensus, by a law which these very 55 parties will have to agree to, we can perhaps try to reduce the number of parties. That's the sentiment which is expressing. It has nothing to do with coalition politics. We all know we are in an era of that. We know that we cannot, but it could be still a constructive suggestion for the future.
Okay, I will take a quick interjection because if from Ravi Shankar Prasad, in the backdrop of the fact that the manifesto was released, the Prime Minister said left parties are regressive. Now he says regional parties are an obstacle to growth. Will he tie up with regressive parties that are an obstacle to growth after May 16th? That we'll know only after May 16th. Quick interjection from Ravi Shankar Prasad to that first question.
Well, Arnav, the Prime Minister of India was not speaking as a professor of political science in a seminar. The Prime Minister means something, it has to be taken very seriously. And the surprising part it has come from a Prime Minister who has been heading a coalition government by so many parties together. I think this whole comment is against the whole federal principle of our constitution. Regional parties have a role. Large number of them have done very well with popular support, without any patronage from the Congress party. Therefore, to wish them away as an obstacle to growth is the real point in issue which you are trying to highlight perhaps.
Okay.
And I say this particular expression is highly condemnable. Many regional parties have done well. I think if Mr. Manmohan Singh is trying to lament his own agony as to how he has dealt with them, if he would have been a towering leader, he could have been able to brush them aside. But that cannot be generalized to the extent that
I would like to
regional
move to
parties
question
per se
2.
are
In
obstacles
an
to growth.
interview to Times Now, Lalu Prasad ended, Mr. Singhvi, I don't know if you noticed that, he ended the third front, fourth front divide. He said everybody will work with everybody, everything is possible, and it's only perhaps politicians who are looking at fronts now. If that is the case, the third and fourth fronts are coming together as it appeared clear after that interview in Patna. Are you worried? Because you could get sidelined. The Congress could be fewer seats than the third and fourth front together. In that case, you'll have to give way to them.
There is no question, Arnav. These are persons who are still with the UPA. They are persons who have been with the UPA. And it is true that the only permanent divide of Indian politics, that's the reality, it's a fact of life. The only permanent, irremovable, unerasable watershed of Indian politics is Congress on the one side and the BJP and perhaps a few parties like the Shiv Sena on the other. Never the twain shall meet applies to these two sets of parties. It is equally true that other parties have been over the years changing their partnerships, and that's a fact of life. And to an extent it's true that a lot of these things will fall into place after the 16th. But that is not to say that there is suddenly a new worry because there is another fifth front which is equal to the fourth and third front put together. There is no such thing.
Okay. Now, a lot of the viewers of News Hour, Mr. Prasad, write back to us after the show and please. We have 50 reporters covering the voting that's going to happen in phase 1 tomorrow, that's spread over 124 constituencies in 17 states. Extremely critical round of voting, and to take us through what is likely to happen tomorrow and also the description of the regions where voting will happen tomorrow, I have to my right, of course, our political editor Navika Kumar. Navika, thanks. Mahesh Rangarajan, very eminent Decision 09 panelist, is with us, as is Poranjay Guatakuta. It's very nice to have both of you on the show. I just want to tell our viewers that we want to go through reporter to reporter in each of the areas. We have maximum coverage and we have our reporters on the ground. So without wasting any time, let me first introduce our first set of 4 reporters we have on the show this evening. There you see them. Sanket Upadhyay is reporting on the right hand side of your screen from Varanasi. He will be there through tomorrow. To his left, Dhanya Rajendran is reporting from Hyderabad this evening. Madhav Das Gopalakrishnan, who's flown down from Delhi and is reporting from Gorakhpur in Uttar Pradesh. And Rahul Shiv Shankar is reporting from the very key area of Chhapra in Bihar, in Sharan in particular. That's where Rahul Shiv Shankar is, where there's the big contest. Rajiv Rudi versus Lalu Prasad. I mean, the contest of the moment and the day. Let me go first to get a sense on the ground from Sanket Upadhyay. Sanket, where you are in Varanasi, tell me, what is the pulse on the mood? Because people have said that there isn't the level of enthusiasm in this election because there isn't a single nodal issue this time. What's the sense you are getting on the ground?
Well, a very good evening to you, Arnab. I am at present at the Dashashwamedh Ghat of Varanasi, far from the election madness and the election hullabaloo. This place is as quiet and as serene as ever. But as far as elections are concerned, this time around, many people feel that simply because of the candidates that have been put in by the BJP as well as the BSP, this seems to be an election which could perhaps, be contested on communal grounds, simply because of the way the entire campaigning was promoted in this entire area. Apart from that, both BJP and the BSP have in fact been talking about national issues and how these issues are in fact of importance to people here. But then scratch a little further and you find that at the very root of it, everything that is being done by these candidates is something which is in question, and the Election Commission is keeping a very close watch on this. Also, the area of Ghazipur, the neighboring areas of Azamgarh have been declared ultra sensitive by the Election Commission, because of which, Arnab, extra security personnel of the Central Paramilitary Forces are being deputed here just to make sure that no untoward incident happens in these elections.
Now we are talking about the nature of the election this time in Uttar Pradesh. Before I go to Madhav in Gorakhpur, what's the sense you're getting of how the parties have panned themselves out, and how similar is this election to 2007, Mahesh?
It's different. 2007 was effectively a referendum on Mulayam Singh government in power, and Mayawati was able to use the law and order issue to virtually consolidate the anti-incumbent vote in her favor. This time it's a national election, and of course the stakes are very high for both of them. At the same time, both BJP and Congress trying to make a comeback. You can see Dr. Joshi in Varanasi is shifted from Allahabad, Mahabir Prasad, Yogi Adityanath. This is a seat which has for long been a sort of stronghold of the Mutt of Gorakhpur. So the stakes are quite high for the national parties as well. The main spotlight will of course in UP be on the SP and the BSP.
Absolutely, and the question is, if Mayawati were to go by the 2007 performance, then she could actually end up getting 53 to 55 seats. That's the estimate. If she were to get something like that, which some say is unlikely, she will be perhaps the third biggest player after the BJP and the Congress. That's what people are looking for. Let me go quickly to Gorakhpur, one of the constituencies Mahesh was talking about, to get a sense from you, Madhav, on the ground on how that key constituency is panning out, the players in Gorakhpur and the politics of UP that you're seeing around it.
Well, yes, Arnab, of course, Gorakhpur is a very key constituency in eastern Uttar Pradesh, most of which is going to go to the polls tomorrow. In Gorakhpur itself, of course, huge security arrangements, just as Sanket was telling us, a lot of booths that are very, very sensitive. There are going to be central government employees working as observers in each and every one of those sensitive booths, who are going to be directly submitting their reports to the central government observers, as well as, of course, apart from that, teams of the police and the district administration that are going to be actually going around these areas to ensure that law and order is maintained. But as far as the Gorakhpur seat itself is concerned, a very interesting three-corner fight that's actually happening in the town itself. There is, of course, the sitting MP from here, Yogi Adityanath, who's won at least 3 times in the past. There's also, of course, Vinay Shankar Tiwari of the Samajwadi Party, and of course there is also the popular Bhojpuri film star Manoj Tiwari, who's said to be the Amitabh Bachchan of these parts. It really remains to be seen if his stardom will actually work for him in the polls. So very interesting fight happening in Gorakhpur itself, Arnab.
Right. Look at the vote share there of Yogi Adityanath, well over 50%, hugely significant. What's at stake for the BJP? How is it looking overall in UP this time?
Well, very, very clearly the BJP is looking for a revival of sorts in Uttar Pradesh. This time around it senses a chance, because there is a four-cornered fight really. There is the Samajwadi Party, there is the BSP, Congress and the BJP, and the BJP is looking to increase its tally. And Gorakhpur, one area where the BJP had over 51% vote, that was Yogi Adityanath. The next contender was about 20% away. That was the kind of vote share. Also in Varanasi, very crucial contest there between Murli Manohar Joshi and of course Mohammad Ansari. Yeah. That's going to be Mukhtar Ansari. That's going to be something that people are going to be looking forward to. And we've had such a lot of debate on criminalization of politics. All of that happening in Uttar Pradesh. And if just a little factoid, last time the maximum number of women contestants were in Uttar Pradesh, 61 in the 2004 elections, and the maximum number of women winning in a state was also Uttar Pradesh. 7 women MPs thrown up in the 2004 elections from Uttar Pradesh.
You talked about the differences or the similarity with what happened in 2007, what's happening today. Firstly, the question is, will the upper caste, will the Brahmins this time vote with the Bahujan Samaj Party in the way they did in 2007?
You doubt that this time?
No, one moment. There was, at that point of time, this anti-Mulayam kind of sentiment which dominated. This time round, we're not so sure. That's what both the Congress and the Bharatiya Janata Party are depending on, the upper caste vote not going with the Bahujan Samaj Party. You talked about Yogi Adityanath.
It's actually happened in a few elections.
If you look at the figures for 2004, there were 7 constituencies in Uttar Pradesh, of the ones which are going to the polls, where the victory margin was less than 3%. Mahavir Prasad won, his victory margin was 2.6%. And if you look at in Padrona, Robertsganj, Chandoli, Salimpur, Ghosi, Azamgarh, in many of these constituencies, the difference between the SP and the BSP was very, very narrow. 1%, 2%, 3%. So it's not going to be such a cakewalk for the Bahujan Samaj Party.
And that could make a difference from the 2007 result. Let me go to Rahul Shivshankar. I want to get a sense of how the mood is in Bihar. And Rahul, you've been traveling from Patna through to Chapra, and you've got a sense there of the mood. Also, that very key fight tomorrow, it's a make or break for the very high-profile Rajiv Rudi in Chapra.
That's right, Arnab. I'm standing here, and I'm going to choose my words with deliberation. On ground zero in the war for Bihar. Yes, there is a battle raging here, definitely. It's Lalu Prasad versus Rajiv Rudi. Lalu's focus is beyond this particular constituency. It's beyond Saran. He's looking at the bigger picture. He's looking to dislodge Nitish Kumar. He said it in one of his first election meetings here, the first of the 12 visits to Chapra. He stood under that statue right behind me of Jayaprakash Narayan, and he says, I am going to bring in a revolution in Bihar. A political tsunami is what I'm going to unleash in the next few weeks, and I'm going to make sure that Nitish Kumar is swept out of power. And at this moment, however, that was seen to be, at least on the ground, received with a pinch of salt, because it's been seen as a little bit of bluster on the part of Lalu Yadav. If we look at the situation in Bihar as of now, and we look at it purely mathematically, if you look at the 2005 assembly elections, well, you've seen, if you project those figures, Nitish Kumar could end up getting about 36 seats, and that's the projection which rung home very, very quickly, and Lalu woke up to it, and he decided that he needed to present a united front. He needed to change that equation by once again going back to Paswan, stitching up this alliance. But Nitish Kumar has also done his arithmetic very, very well, because for Nitish Kumar, he's eyeing the bigger picture, the national role in politics. Lalu, battle for survival, very, very crucial contest, not just here in this particular constituency, but for the Yadav vote and the Muslim vote. Both those votes very, very crucial in determining the outcome. You have a situation when in West Champaran, you have Lalu's brother-in-law who's going to be contesting in the second phase, if I'm not mistaken, and he is already threatening Lalu and saying that if I win this seat, then your hold over the Yadav vote is over. People will say, the Yadavs are not backing Lalu Yadav anymore on the ground, and that will be a huge blow ahead of the finals, which are of course next year, which is the assembly election. And that's one of the biggest worries for Lalu Yadav. Is the Yadav community going to stand behind him completely, wholeheartedly? He's gone out there and he has asked various people not to vote for his estranged brother-in-law. But that, again, all comes down to, of course, how he manages the equation on the ground. As of now, Nitish and the BJP have the lead. Nitish has been very, very clever. Social engineering working absolutely optimally. From 2005 to now, he's built up a caste coalition of the most backward castes in the state, the backward Muslims as well as the Mahadalits. And he has built on that in such a way that over the 7 last by-elections that have taken place, 4 for the Vidhan Sabha, 3 for the Lok Sabha, he's not even lost one. In fact, he's pulled a seat over from the Congress party, and you can make out already that on good governance plank is what his referendum is going to be. He's already challenging Lalu on that one particular issue, and most importantly, he has the numbers. He has the caste coalition.
Right, Rahul, before we look at Bihar in a great detail, a couple of very key questions emerge. And Mahesh, as Rahul was reporting there, what I was thinking about was if it were to be in terms of strategy, you see that kind of vote share. Let's not talk this constituency alone. My question to you is, what about other factors? Because does Mayawati, whose politics has been to play the spoiler in the rest of the country, how does her politics emerge, or does it emerge at all seriously in a place like Bihar? There is, even in that constituency, there is a important Muslim BSP candidate as well.
See, there is a very interesting, striking similarity between the present situation of Nitish and Mayawati. If you look 5 years at that time, Lalu Prasad Yadav was very powerful in Bihar. The government was still under his control. Yes. Mulayam's government was in power in Lucknow. Between then and now, this huge shift has happened. The equations changed and Mayawati's government came to power in Lucknow. Nitish Kumar's government came to power in Patna, and both have something in common. I'd argue they're defining a type of post-caste politics. Of course, they're using caste as a building block, but when she talks about bringing the poor together in the Sarv Samaj, Nitish talks about Bihar. You know, he's got this very interesting slogan of Hum, Hindu or Muslim, as opposed to the old combination of, the backwards and the Muslims. The BSP is still a small force in Bihar, but I think that Mayawati will have an impact beyond UP, simply because she's seen for the first time, you're getting a Dalit who is seen as having aspirations which are somewhere on the political horizon of being Prime Minister. Right. So that might have some impact. May or may not impact an X or Y seat.
Also, Arnab, that particular constituency from where Rahul was reporting, the Saran constituency, redrawn earlier Chhapra, Rajiv Pratap Rudy lost the election to Lalu Prasad the last time around, came into the Rajya Sabha now just for a 1.5 term after a seat that was vacated. So even for Rajiv Pratap Rudy, who was the former civil aviation minister in the NDA government from the BJP, it's a battle for survival.
But it's great positioning, isn't it?
For both of them.
To be positioned against Lalu Prasad,
also
remember, at a different level.
And also remember, he did that last time as well. He was against Lalu Prasad, but Lalu is fighting from two constituencies. So you have to look at the psychology from there on. Why two constituency? Last time also and this time again.
For Lalu, why is it so important? Why is it for Lalu Prasad Yadav a battle for survival? See, why did Nitish come to power? Because Lalu Prasad had been quite, complacent about development. He wasn't. Now he's projecting a different image. He says, I'm the person who turned around the Indian Railways, rightly or wrongly. So the same Lalu Prasad Yadav, who said, I don't want the roads of Bihar to be as smooth as Hema Malini is seeking, the same guy who mocked at, so-called development, has realized that Nitish Kumar is a very, very tough customer. And it's just no way that he can hope to get 22 out of those 40 Lok Sabha seats. The JD and the JDU just got 6. So it's his battle, possibly his toughest battle to remain politically.
Nandita Sunecha actually this morning did an extensive, very interesting interview, and I'd like to go to you next, Nandita, because your interview with Lalu Prasad really spoke a lot, and our viewers must have heard large parts and chunks of that interview. It appeared that he was at a national level breaking the third front, fourth front divide. But that's not my question. My question is, you have been traveling with Lalu Prasad. What do you see of his political style now emerging? A, B, his levels of confidence, and C, has he confided his political strategy with you, at least for Bihar, in terms of the main parties he's facing this time?
Well, Arnab, I've been trying to chase Lalu Prasad Yadav for the last couple of days, and I must admit that the man has been campaigning very hard in Bihar. Now, whether the reason for that is a sense of insecurity that he feels out of Nitish Kumar's, the way he's been sort of trying to sell his entire campaign on the basis of governance, on the development plank, there is a sense, although Lalu will never admit it on record. And just to give you a sense of where I am reporting from right now, Arnab, this is Siwan. This is the mafia lord Mohammad Shahabuddin's turf, and this is a place where traditionally in the last 10 to 15 years there hasn't been a single election won by anyone except Shahabuddin. Now, of course, this is the first election which will be fought in his absence. He is, of course, behind bars. His wife is contesting from here. But how things pan out tomorrow here in Siwan, about 150 kilometers from Patna, Arnab, is going to be an indicator on how much things have changed in Bihar. Whether it is going to be a free and fair election here, there have been many reports of booth capturing, kidnapping, murders during elections in the past in Siwan. Whether violence can be contained here, whether it is going to be, a situation where law and order will prevail. Of course, the administration trying very hard to make sure that happens. But how things work out here in Siwan is going to be a major indicator on how things have changed in Bihar, and whether Nitish Kumar's pro-administration, pro-law and order plank has really worked or not. What people here are saying is this is going to be a different election. This is an area where earlier a non-RJD flag being hoisted up could result in major violence. This time Shahabuddin is not there. His reign of terror, we are told, is absent, and this is a major constituency that Lalu will be looking for. But because there is a sense that in Shahabuddin's absence, could the RJD do the same wonders that it's managed to do here, 4 elections having fought here. So this constituency tomorrow, Arnab, is going to be a main indicator of how much things have changed in Bihar on the ground, and Lalu will be looking very closely here.
And as you have rightly pointed out, as we are flashing that story there about country-made bombs being found in Siwan's regular affair in that area, this is one of the biggest challenges for both the administration, the government and the election commission tomorrow. How peaceful will the first round of voting be in these parts of Bihar, especially in places like Siwan? We're taking a quick break and coming back, and then we are going down south.
He has proved a weak Prime Minister, particularly because he has for the first time in a democracy devalued the high office of Prime Minister.
जोर जोर से बातें करना काफी नहीं है। मैं मानता हूँ that I cannot match Advani ji in public speaking or in asserting things, but I believe that the proof of the pudding is in eating.